A white judge sends an innocent black girl to prison convinced she's just another case, just another name on his docket. But what he doesn't know? She's the daughter of the most powerful man in the justice system, his own boss. And when the truth comes out, his entire world is about to come crashing down. How far will her father go to bring justice? And will the judge survive the reckoning that's coming for him? This is a story of betrayal, redemption, and the fight for a justice system that sees all people as equal. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Sunlight filtered through Maya Johnson's cream-colored curtains, casting warm patterns across her carefully organized desk. Her Yale Law School poster caught the morning light, the bold blue letters seeming to glow with promise against the crisp white paper. Maya stretched and reached for her phone, a smile spreading across her face as she read a text from her best friend about meeting after school. The familiar comfort of her bedroom with its neat bookshelves and color-coordinated study materials wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Perfect timing, she whispered to herself, sitting up in bed and running her fingers through her curly hair. Her eyes drifted to the framed photograph on her nightstand, a younger version of herself standing proudly next to her father on the courthouse steps, his Chief Justice robes flowing in the wind. His hand rested protectively on her shoulder in the photo, both of them beaming with shared dreams. That had been the day she decided to follow in his footsteps. Tomorrow was Mom's birthday, and Maya was determined to find something special. Camille Johnson deserved the world for all she did for their family. The endless encouragement, the late-night study sessions with hot chocolate, the unwavering support through every challenge. The thought of surprising her mother made Maya's heart warm as she got ready for school, carefully choosing her outfit and gathering her books into her leather messenger bag. Downstairs, the kitchen was alive with morning activity. The smell of coffee and fresh pancakes filled the air as Camille stood at the stove, humming softly to herself while she worked her magic with the spatula. Charles Johnson sat at the table, his broad shoulders hunched over the morning paper, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. The morning sunlight streaming through the bay windows caught the silver in his temples. "Morning, sweetheart," Camille called out, flipping a perfectly golden pancake with practiced ease. "Sleep well?" "Morning, Mom." "Morning, Dad," Maya replied, settling into her usual spot at the table, the familiar wooden chair creaking slightly beneath her. The TV mounted on the kitchen wall caught her attention as a news anchor's voice filled the room, the volume low but clear. Raising questions about judicial bias in the Harrison case, with critics claiming the ruling shows a pattern of discriminatory sentencing across multiple districts. Charles's frown deepened as he lowered his newspaper, the pages crinkling in his grip. "These cases keep piling up," he muttered, shaking his head in frustration. "Some of these judges shouldn't even be on the bench. The system needs—" "Like the ones you appointed, Dad?" Maya teased, trying to lighten the mood with a playful smile. But her father's sigh was heavy with concern, his shoulders sagging slightly. "It's more complicated than that, Maya. Sometimes people show their true colors only after they gain power." He took off his glasses, rubbing his temples with weathered fingers. "The courthouse is a mess right now. 3 major appeals this week alone, and each one more troubling than the last." Camille placed a plate of pancakes in front of Maya, her warm hand lingering on her daughter's shoulder with maternal affection. "Now about this birthday shopping you're planning," she said, changing the subject with practiced grace. "Please don't go overboard, sweetie. Your love is all I need." "Mom, you say that every year," Maya laughed, drizzling maple syrup over her breakfast in perfect circles. "But you deserve something special. You do so much for us." "Just be careful when you're out shopping," Camille advised, her voice taking on that familiar protective tone that Maya knew so well. "You know how I worry about you being out alone." Maya nodded, savoring the fluffy pancakes that melted in her mouth. After breakfast, she gathered her things for school, already planning her afternoon stop at Whitmore Boutique. The store was expensive, but they carried the kind of elegant accessories her mother loved, the ones that made her feel special. The school day passed in a blur of AP classes and college preparation discussions, with Maya taking detailed notes and participating in every discussion. When the final bell rang, She headed straight for the upscale mall where Whitmore Boutique stood among other high-end stores, its elegant facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. The boutique's interior was all gleaming glass and polished marble, with carefully arranged displays of designer items that sparkled under crystal chandeliers. Maya walked in confidently, her sandals clicking against the floor as her eyes scanned the shelves for something that would make her mother's eyes light up. The silk scarves caught her attention. Their intricate patterns and rich colors reminded her of the art pieces her mother collected and lovingly displayed throughout their home. What Maya didn't notice was Savannah Whitmore watching her from behind a display of expensive handbags, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping against a glass counter with quiet impatience. A smirk played across Savannah's face as she observed Maya browsing alone, her eyes narrowing with barely concealed contempt. Her red-painted lips pressed into a thin line as she watched the young girl move deeper into the store. Maya walked into Whitmore Boutique, the cool air conditioning a welcome relief from the warm afternoon. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting rainbow reflections across gleaming glass display cases filled with luxury items. Her footsteps were silent on the plush cream carpet as she made her way toward the jewelry section, breathing in the subtle scent of vanilla and leather that permeated the high-end store. "This has to be perfect," she whispered to herself, scanning the elegant displays. Her mother deserved something special, something that showed just how much Maya appreciated everything she'd done. All those late nights helping with homework, the countless sacrifices, the unwavering support through every challenge. A delicate gold bracelet caught her eye. The intricate pattern reminded her of the way her mother's eyes crinkled when she smiled, like sunlight dancing through leaves. Maya leaned closer, examining the craftsmanship, running her finger along the glass above the delicate chain. When she checked the price tag, her heart sank a little, but she had been saving up for months, carefully setting aside money from her part-time job at the library. Unbeknownst to Maya, Savannah Whitmore stood near a display of designer handbags, her manicured fingers tapping against her arm as she watched. Her lips curled into a slight smirk as she observed Maya's careful browsing, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling over one shoulder. While Maya remained absorbed in examining the bracelet, Savannah moved with practiced grace toward a different jewelry case. She picked up an expensive diamond necklace, pretending to admire it in the light, turning it this way and that so the stones caught the gleam of the chandeliers. Her eyes darted around, making sure no cameras were focused on her. Maya's tote bag sat slightly open on her shoulder, presenting the perfect opportunity. In one fluid motion, Savannah passed behind Maya and dropped the necklace into the open bag. Maya, still focused on the bracelet, didn't notice the slight movement or the whisper of silk as Savannah's designer blouse brushed past her. Savannah's heels clicked against the floor as she approached Mr. Connolly, the store manager. He stood near the counter, nervously adjusting his tie, a habit he'd developed from years of catering to the wealthy Whitmore family, whose name adorned the store's elegant facade. "Mr. Connolly," Savannah whispered, her voice dripping with false concern, her perfectly painted lips barely moving. "I hate to say this, but I just saw Maya Johnson steal something. You might want to check her bag before she leaves." The manager's face paled, small beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Are you certain, Miss Whitmore?" "Absolutely," Savannah replied, her eyes wide with manufactured innocence. "I saw it with my own eyes." A hint of satisfaction flickered across her features before disappearing behind her concerned expression. Mr. Connolly nodded quickly and gestured to the security guards. Two burly men in dark uniforms moved to block the exit, just as Maya started walking toward the counter, the gold bracelet in her hand, a small smile playing on her lips as she imagined her mother's reaction. "Excuse me, miss," one guard said, his voice firm but professional. "We need to check your bag." Maya blinked in confusion, her hand instinctively tightening around the bracelet. "My bag? Why?" Before she could protest further, the second guard unzipped her tote. The diamond necklace tumbled out, landing on the carpet with a soft thud, the stones glittering accusingly under the bright lights. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Her hands began to shake as she stared at the necklace, her mind struggling to process what was happening. I didn't take that," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, her throat tight with panic. I've never seen it before. Savannah stepped forward, pressing a hand to her chest in an exaggerated gesture of shock, her diamond rings catching the light. Oh my God, Maya. How could you? Her voice carried across the store, drawing the attention of other customers who began to whisper and point, their faces a blur of judgment and curiosity. Mr. Connolly shook his head, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resignation as he tugged at his collar. I'm afraid we have to call the police. Maya's heart thundered in her chest as she looked around the store. Faces stared back at her, some curious, others judgmental, all seeming to close in around her. Her legs felt weak, and the room seemed to spin slightly, the crystal chandeliers above becoming a dizzying kaleidoscope. Please, she said, her voice cracking with desperation. This is a mistake. I didn't steal anything. But Mr. Connolly was already reaching for the phone, and in the distance, police sirens began to wail, their sound growing louder with each passing second, marking the beginning of Maya's nightmare. The harsh fluorescent light buzzed overhead as Maya sat in the stark interrogation room. Her hands trembled on the cold metal table, and her heart pounded so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. The room smelled of stale coffee and cleaning supplies, making her stomach turn. The walls seemed to close in around her, their dull gray paint peeling slightly at the corners. Detective Harris leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his notepad with an irritating rhythm. His navy suit jacket was wrinkled, and his tie hung loose around his neck. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd been working long hours, but that didn't excuse his attitude. Look, kid, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. We've got witnesses, security footage, and the necklace in your bag. You were caught red-handed. Please, Maya's voice cracked. Someone put it in my bag. I didn't steal anything. I was there to buy my mom a birthday present. Tears threatened to spill, but she blinked them back fiercely. Her fingers interlaced and separated repeatedly, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. Officer Riley shifted uncomfortably by the door. He was young, maybe in his mid-20s, with kind eyes that showed his internal struggle. His freshly pressed uniform and perfectly polished badge contrasted sharply with Harris's disheveled appearance. He cleared his throat but remained silent, his rookie status keeping him from speaking up. That's what they all say, Detective Harris smirked, running a hand through his graying hair. Rich kid thinks she can get away with anything, huh? Before Maya could respond, the door burst open with enough force to rattle the two-way mirror. Camille Johnson rushed in, her face etched with worry, her designer handbag swinging wildly at her side. Baby, she cried, moving to embrace Maya, but Detective Harris held up his hand, palm out like a traffic cop. Ma'am, please stay back. We're in the middle of an interrogation. Charles Johnson entered behind his wife, his presence filling the small room like a gathering storm. His usual composed demeanor barely contained his anger, visible only in the slight twitch of his jaw and the steel in his dark eyes. I'm Chief Justice Johnson, he stated, his voice steady but intense, each word carrying the weight of his authority. And that's my daughter you're interrogating without proper representation. Detective Harris's smug expression faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, straightening his crooked tie. Your Honor, with all due respect, your daughter was caught stealing a $5,000 necklace from Whitmore Boutique. My daughter, Charles emphasized each word, stepping closer to Harris's desk, is innocent. Camille stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly until her knuckles turned white. Please, this has to be a mistake. Maya would never steal anything. She's going to Yale next year, for heaven's sake. She has a full scholarship. Mrs. Johnson, Harris shrugged, spreading his hands in a gesture of false sympathy. The evidence says otherwise. We have multiple witnesses, including Savannah Whitmore herself, who saw your daughter take the necklace. Savannah? Maya's voice rose, her chair scraping against the floor as she sat up straighter. She's lying. She must have... But Harris cut her off with a sharp look that made her words die in her throat. We're charging her with grand larceny, Harris announced, standing up and adjusting his belt with an air of finality. Given the value of the item... This is absurd, Charles interrupted, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. I want to see this supposed evidence immediately. Every frame of footage, every witness statement. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but your position doesn't change the facts. Your daughter will be processed like any other suspect." Harris's words carried a hint of satisfaction that made Maya's skin crawl. Camille let out a sob that seemed to come from deep in her soul, reaching for Maya again. This time, Officer Riley stepped aside slightly, his conscience apparently winning over protocol, allowing mother and daughter to embrace briefly before Harris ordered them separated with a sharp bark. Maya was led to a holding cell, her legs feeling like lead with each step down the fluorescent-lit corridor. The cell was small, with gray walls and a single metal bench bolted to the floor. The sound of the door clanging shut echoed through her bones, a finalizing sound that made everything feel terrifyingly real. Sitting alone on the cold bench, Maya stared at the blank walls, counting the scratches previous occupants had left behind. Her mind raced through the events at the boutique, trying to piece together how this had happened. She remembered Savannah's cold smile, the way she'd bumped into her near the jewelry counter. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she wiped it away roughly with the back of her hand, leaving a slight red mark on her skin. She wouldn't break down. She couldn't. Through the small window in the cell door, she could hear her mother's muffled pleas and her father's controlled but angry voice echoing down the hallway. Maya squared her shoulders, drawing in a deep breath that smelled of disinfectant and despair. She was innocent, and somehow she would prove it. She had to, or everything she'd worked for would crumble around her. The Johnson family's elegant living room felt like a prison of its own that evening. Camille's heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she paced back and forth, her normally warm brown eyes now red and swollen from crying. Her hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold it together. The family photos on the walls seemed to mock their current nightmare, happy faces frozen in better times. "We have to get her out," Camille sobbed, her voice breaking. "Our baby girl can't spend the night in jail. She's all alone, Charles. All alone." She grabbed a tissue from the box on the coffee table, crushing it between her trembling fingers. Charles sat rigid in his leather armchair, his powerful hands clenched into tight fists. His jaw worked silently as he stared straight ahead, but behind his stern expression, his brilliant legal mind was already mapping out strategies, considering judges, analyzing precedents. The weight of his position as Chief Justice, usually a source of pride, now felt like a crushing burden. Camille stopped in front of him, her tears falling freely now. "Say something. Why aren't you saying anything?" Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, filling the room with her desperation. Charles remained eerily silent, his breathing measured and controlled. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to mock their helplessness, each second another moment their daughter spent alone in custody. Meanwhile, at the county jail, Maya stood perfectly still as the guard pressed her fingertips into black ink, then rolled each one carefully onto the fingerprint card. The ink felt cold and sticky on her skin, like tiny spiders crawling across her fingers. She tried not to flinch when the guard grabbed her wrist to position her hand, the woman's grip unnecessarily firm. "Next finger," the guard said mechanically, as if she processed innocent 17-year-old girls every day. Her face remained impassive, avoiding Maya's eyes as she went through the routine. After fingerprinting, they led Maya to a holding cell where 3 other girls lounged on metal benches. They looked up when she entered, sizing her up with curious stares. One girl, with bright pink hair and multiple piercings, smirked and whispered something to her friend, causing them both to snicker quietly. Maya's school uniform suddenly felt like a beacon, marking her as different. Maya found an empty corner and sank down onto the cold bench, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. The cell smelled of disinfectant and stale air, with undertones of sweat and fear. The concrete walls seemed to close in around her as reality sank in. She was actually in jail. Her father's courtroom suddenly felt a million miles away. As midnight approached, Maya pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible on the hard bench. The other girls had fallen asleep, their soft breathing the only sound besides the occasional echo of guards' footsteps in the corridor. Someone down the hall was crying softly. "I have to be strong," Maya whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. She pressed her forehead against her knees, fighting back tears. I have to be strong. Her school tie felt like it was choking her, but she didn't dare move to loosen it. The words became her mantra as she rocked slightly back and forth, trying to comfort herself in this cold, alien place. She thought of her mother's warm hugs, her father's quiet strength. She had to hold on to those memories to make it through this nightmare. The college acceptance letter sitting on her desk at home felt like it belonged to another life entirely. The harsh overhead lights never dimmed, making it impossible to tell how much time had passed. Maya's muscles ached from sitting in the same position, but she didn't dare lie down on the suspicious-looking bench. Instead, she kept whispering those same words over and over, willing herself to believe them. I have to be strong. I have to be strong. Each repetition felt a little more hollow than the last. The morning sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across courtroom 3B's polished wooden floors. Maya Johnson sat rigid at the defendant's table, her trembling hands gripping its edge until her knuckles turned white. Her navy blue dress, chosen carefully for court with her mother's help the night before, felt suffocating now, the collar too tight against her throat. Stay calm, Maya. The evidence is on our side, her attorney Olivia Carter whispered, placing a reassuring hand on Maya's arm. But Maya could hear the slight tremor of uncertainty in her voice, the same fear that had been growing since the preliminary hearing. Maya glanced back at her parents. Camille Johnson's face was already streaked with silent tears, her hands clasped in desperate prayer. Charles Johnson sat perfectly still beside her, his expression unreadable behind his wire-rimmed glasses. His dark suit and commanding presence usually brought comfort, but today, even he seemed powerless against the machinery of justice grinding into motion. Prosecutor Robert Delaney rose, straightening his red tie with practiced precision. His voice boomed through the courtroom like a judge's gavel. Your Honor, this is a simple case of privilege gone wrong. Ms. Johnson, despite her advantages in life, chose to steal a $40,000 necklace. He gestured to the security footage playing on the courtroom screen, his movements sharp and accusatory. The evidence is clear. The necklace was found in her possession. Maya's heart pounded against her ribs as she watched herself on screen, innocently browsing the store's display cases. Then static filled the screen, crackling and jumping. When the image cleared, security guards were pulling the necklace from her bag, their faces stern and unforgiving. Olivia Carter stood next, her heels clicking against the floor like a metronome counting down precious seconds. Your Honor, my client has a perfect academic record, early acceptance to Yale Law School, and zero history of misconduct. The security footage conveniently malfunctions at the crucial moment. We demand to know why. This gap in evidence cannot be ignored. Judge Ethan Wallace sighed heavily, adjusting his glasses with manicured fingers. This isn't a criminal conspiracy, Ms. Carter. Let's focus on the facts at hand. His tone dripped with condescension, each word a subtle reminder of his authority. Charles Johnson's jaw tightened as his keen legal mind recognized the signs. He'd seen that dismissive look before. Wallace's trademark response when he'd already made up his mind. Evidence be damned. The Chief Justice's fingers dug into the wooden bench before him. The defendant was caught with stolen merchandise, Wallace continued, his tone bored, as if discussing a parking ticket rather than a young woman's future. Her academic achievements, while admirable, do not excuse criminal behavior. Camille's quiet sobs echoed in the hushed courtroom like a mournful hymn. Maya wanted to turn around, to run into her mother's arms and hide from this nightmare. But she remained frozen in place, her spine straight despite the weight crushing down on her shoulders. Your Honor, Olivia pressed, desperation creeping into her professional demeanor. The missing footage is irrelevant, Wallace cut her off with a wave of his hand. The fact remains that Ms. Johnson was found with stolen property. The law is clear on this matter. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, each second thunderous in the tense silence, as Wallace shuffled his papers with deliberate slowness. Maya's breath caught in her throat as he looked down at her with cold eyes that seemed to see through her without really seeing her at all. The evidence is circumstantial at best, Wallace declared, his words falling like stones. However, I see no reason to grant leniency. The defendant will serve 1 year in juvenile detention." The words hit like physical blows, each syllable a punch to Maya's gut. She gasped, her world spinning as the courtroom tilted on its axis. Behind her, Camille's scream pierced the air like shattered glass. Charles remained silent, but his knuckles turned white as he gripped the wooden bench, his eyes fixed on Wallace with an intensity that could burn through steel. In that moment, something shifted in the Chief Justice's gaze, a silent promise that this injustice would not go unanswered. Maya's small figure disappeared down the courthouse corridor, flanked by 2 officers. The metallic click of her handcuffs echoed against the marble walls, each sound piercing Camille Johnson's heart like a knife. "No, no, my baby." Camille's legs gave out and she collapsed into Charles's arms, her body racked with sobs. But Charles didn't move to comfort her. His dark eyes remained fixed on Judge Wallace, who was casually gathering his papers at the bench, acting as if he hadn't just destroyed a young girl's life. Wallace finally looked up, noticing Charles's unwavering stare. A slight frown crossed his weathered face as he tucked his papers into his leather briefcase. "Court is adjourned," he announced unnecessarily to the nearly empty room, his voice carrying the bored tone of someone who'd already moved on to thinking about lunch. "This was a routine case," Wallace muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Clear evidence, clear verdict." He didn't even bother to look at the grieving parents as he stepped down from the bench. Charles gently passed his sobbing wife to their lawyer. His footsteps were measured and deliberate as he approached Wallace, each step echoing in the quiet courtroom. The judge barely glanced up, clearly assuming Charles was just another emotional parent he'd have to dismiss. "You just sentenced the wrong girl," Charles said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that would have made wiser men pause. But Wallace, secure in his position and power, simply waved his hand dismissively. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but the evidence was clear. Perhaps you should focus on helping your daughter learn from this experience rather than threatening a judge." Wallace's patronizing tone made it clear he had no idea who Charles Johnson really was. Charles didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He simply stood there, his presence becoming more imposing with each passing second. Wallace finally looked up, meeting Charles's eyes for the first time. Something in that steady gaze made the judge's smug expression falter slightly. But the moment passed and Wallace turned away, straightening his robes with an irritated huff. He strode toward his chambers, clearly considering the matter closed. Charles watched him go, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled out his phone and pressed a single number on speed dial. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Find me everything, every biased ruling, every skeleton in Wallace's closet." Charles Johnson sat in his darkened home office, the blue glow of his laptop screen casting harsh shadows across his face. His fingers were steepled under his chin, and his eyes burned with quiet intensity. The room around him felt charged with purpose. Law books lined the walls, their leather spines a testament to years of legal study, and a single framed photo of Maya's high school graduation sat on his desk, her bright smile now a reminder of what he was fighting for. The gold tassel from her cap caught the dim light, making his heart clench. He reached for his phone, his movements deliberate and controlled. The number he dialed was one he rarely used, reserved for situations that required absolute discretion. His wedding ring clinked softly against the phone's surface as he waited. "Marcus, I need you." Charles's voice was steady, masking the rage that simmered beneath. Each word came out measured and precise. "I want everything on Ethan Wallace. Every ruling, every financial record, every skeleton he's tried to bury. Leave no stone unturned." On the other end, Marcus Reed shifted in his chair. The former FBI agent had known Charles for 15 years, but he'd never heard this edge in his voice before. It sent a chill down his spine. "Sir, you're talking about investigating a sitting judge. This could destroy his career. Are you absolutely certain?" "That's the idea." Charles's words carried the weight of cold steel, each syllable sharp enough to cut. "He put my daughter behind bars without a second thought. Now he'll learn what real justice feels like, what true accountability means." Marcus began his work immediately. his fingers flying across the keyboard. Court records filled his computer screen as he dug deeper into Wallace's history, the glow of multiple monitors illuminating his concentrated face. Pattern after pattern emerged. Black defendants receiving maximum sentences for minor offenses, while white defendants walked free for similar crimes. Latino youth tried as adults while white teenagers got probation. The numbers were damning, forming an undeniable picture of prejudice. "Charles," Marcus called back an hour later, his voice tight with urgency. "You need to see this." Wallace's sentencing statistics show clear racial bias. The disparity is too consistent to be coincidental. It's a pattern spanning his entire career. But that wasn't all. As Marcus dug through financial records, something caught his eye. A series of donations to Wallace's re-election campaign, all traced back to shell companies owned by the same wealthy donor. The web of corruption grew clearer with each document he uncovered. "There's more," Marcus said, his voice tense with discovery, papers rustling in the background. "Those campaign donations? They're connected to private prison contracts. Every time Wallace hands down a harsh sentence, someone's making money. The whole system is rigged." Charles absorbed each detail, his expression hardening like granite, his jaw clenched as the pieces fell into place. "Document everything. I want it ironclad. We're going to expose every last bit of this corruption." Across town in his sprawling mansion, Judge Ethan Wallace slept peacefully in his king-sized bed. The moonlight filtered through expensive curtains, casting gentle shadows across his face. His breaths came slow and even, undisturbed by any hint of conscience or concern. The silk sheets rustled softly with each rise and fall of his chest. The judge had no idea that in Charles Johnson's office, the first pieces of his carefully constructed world were being pulled apart, thread by thread. His decades of bias and corruption were about to be exposed. But tonight, he slept without a care in the world, oblivious to the storm gathering on his horizon. Maya stood frozen as the heavy metal door clanged shut behind her, its echo reverberating through her chest like a death knell. The stark fluorescent lights of Silver Creek Juvenile Detention Center cast an unforgiving glare on the institutional green walls, making everything look sickly and artificial. The sharp smell of bleach mixed with sweat made her nose wrinkle, and underneath it all was the metallic tang of fear and desperation. A guard with tired eyes and deep crow's feet gripped her arm, not roughly but firmly enough to make it clear who was in charge. "Move it," he said flatly, steering her down a long corridor lined with cells, his boots squeaking against the polished floor. As they walked, Maya caught glimpses of other girls pressing against their bars to get a look at the new arrival. Some whispered behind cupped hands, others sneered with practiced malice. A voice floated out from one of the cells. "Welcome to hell." Maya kept her eyes forward, chin slightly raised, refusing to let her fear show on her face even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The guard stopped at an open cell and gestured inside with a practiced sweep of his arm. "Home, sweet home," he said, without emotion, already turning away. Maya stepped in, clutching her issued blanket and toiletries to her chest like a shield. The cell was tiny, just a metal bunk with a paper-thin mattress, a steel toilet without a seat, and a small desk bolted to the wall. Everything was cold, hard, institutional, designed to strip away any sense of humanity or comfort. Maya perched on the thin mattress, her back straight despite her trembling hands, which she tucked carefully into her lap. Other girls began filtering past her cell during their scheduled free time, each one studying her with predatory interest like wolves sizing up new prey. One girl with multiple braids woven tight against her scalp and hard eyes that had seen too much lingered by the bars, her posture radiating authority. "Well, well," the girl said, crossing her arms and leaning against the metal frame. "Look what we got here." Maya recognized the voice as belonging to Tanya, whose reputation had preceded her even in the few minutes since arrival. The whispers had painted her as the unofficial queen of the block. "You don't belong here, rich girl." Maya kept her gaze steady but said nothing, remembering what she'd learned about prison dynamics from her father's cases and late-night discussions at the dinner table. Any sign of weakness would make her a target. Any show of defiance would make her an enemy. The safest path was silence, a lesson she'd absorbed through osmosis from years of listening to her father's stories. From his office window overlooking the yard, Warden Mitchell observed the new arrival with quiet interest, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. 20 years in corrections had given him an eye for reading inmates, for seeing past their facades to their true nature. This one carried herself differently. There was fear there, yes, but also a core of steel that reminded him of tempered metal. Her file said she was the daughter of Chief Justice Johnson, convicted of theft despite maintaining her innocence. Something about her demeanor made him wonder. "This one's different," he muttered to himself, watching as Maya navigated her first interactions with the other girls with the careful precision of a tightrope walker. She moved with careful deliberation, neither cowering nor posturing. Smart. He'd seen enough new arrivals to know the ones who survived were those who found the delicate balance between strength and submission. When night fell, the cells grew quiet except for occasional sobs or whispered conversations that echoed off the concrete walls. Maya lay curled on her thin mattress, the rough blanket pulled tight around her shoulders like armor. The reality of her situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. 1 year in this place, separated from everything and everyone she loved, trapped in a world that operated by rules she was only beginning to understand. In the darkness, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, whispering words meant only for herself. "Stay strong." Her voice was barely audible, but in it was the same steel the warden had noticed, a determination that refused to break even here, even now. It was her mother's voice she heard in her head, warm and certain. "You are stronger than you know." The moonlight filtering through the narrow window cast bars of shadow across her face, a perfect metaphor for her current reality. Maya closed her eyes, knowing sleep would be nearly impossible in this strange and hostile place where every sound carried potential threat. But she had to try. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new battles for survival in this concrete jungle. For now, though, all she could do was breathe and remember who she was. Not just an inmate number, but Maya Johnson, daughter of Charles and Camille, a girl who still believed in justice despite everything. And she would not let this place break her, no matter what it took. Charles Johnson's home office was shrouded in early morning darkness, broken only by his desk lamp's soft glow. Scattered across the mahogany surface were countless court files, their pages dog-eared and marked with yellow, sticky notes. Empty coffee cups littered the corners of his desk, testament to his sleepless nights. Charles lifted his coffee cup to his lips, his hands slightly trembling from too much caffeine and too little sleep. The dark circles under his eyes told the story of a father who couldn't rest while his daughter sat in a cell, her life slipping away one day at a time. The door opened with a sharp crack and Marcus Reed strode in, his face tight with barely contained anger. His tie was loosened and his usually pristine suit showed signs of a long night's work. He tossed a thick manila folder onto Charles's desk, sending several papers flying across the polished surface. "You're not going to believe this," Marcus said, flipping open the file to its first page with trembling fingers. Charles leaned forward, his bloodshot eyes focusing on the documents, hunger for justice evident in his intense gaze. "Talk to me," Charles commanded, his voice hoarse from hours of silence and worry. Marcus spread out several court transcripts, his movements quick and precise. "I went through every case Wallace presided over in the past decade. The pattern is clear as day." He pointed to highlighted sections, jabbing his finger at particularly damning passages. African American defendant, maximum sentence. Latino defendant, maximum sentence. White defendant from a wealthy family. Marcus's lip curled in disgust. Probation. Every single time. Charles's hands clenched around his coffee cup so tight the ceramic creaked. "Show me the numbers." Minorities received sentences averaging 85% longer than white defendants for identical crimes. But here's where it gets interesting and infuriating. Marcus pulled out a stack of financial records, spreading them across the desk like a damning mosaic. William Whitmore, Savannah's father, has been padding Wallace's re-election campaign for years. We're talking thousands of dollars in perfectly legal donations, but there's more. He slid forward a bank statement. his hand shaking with suppressed rage. Offshore accounts, monthly deposits from shell companies traced back to Whitmore Enterprises. The paper trail is there, just buried deep enough to avoid casual detection. Charles stood slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with an ominous sound. So my daughter's freedom was bought. His voice was deadly quiet, like the calm before a storm. Wallace sold justice to the highest bidder, and Maya paid the price with her life. The morning sun was starting to peek through the windows, painting golden streaks across the wall as Charles made his way to the kitchen. Camille sat at the counter, her hands wrapped around an untouched cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Her face showed the same exhaustion that marked her husband's. She looked up as Charles entered, noting the steel in his eyes and the determined set of his jaw. "What did you find?" she whispered, both dreading and hoping for an answer. Charles planted his hands on the counter, his knuckles white with tension. "Everything we need." He met his wife's gaze, years of shared pain and determination passing between them. "I'm taking this public." His words carried the weight of a judge's gavel, final and absolute. Camille's eyes widened, understanding the magnitude of what her husband was about to do. The Chief Justice was declaring war on one of his own, and there would be no going back from this moment. The upscale cafe buzzed with the quiet murmur of business meetings and clinking coffee cups. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patterns across the polished hardwood floors. Charles Johnson sat rigidly in a corner booth, his fingers drumming against the leather-bound file in front of him. His perfectly pressed suit and stern expression made him stand out even among the well-dressed lunch crowd. Marcus Reed's presence beside him was steady and watchful, his eyes scanning the room out of old FBI habit, noting every entrance and exit. Rachel Lynde slid into the seat across from them, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. The veteran journalist carried herself with quiet confidence, earned from years of chasing down difficult stories. She'd won 3 Pulitzer nominations for exposing corruption, but Charles had never seen her look this intrigued before she'd even opened a file. Her notebook was already out, pen poised. "Chief Justice," she said quietly, leaning forward slightly. "This must be serious if you're coming to me directly." Charles pushed the file across the polished table, his movements deliberate and controlled. "See for yourself." Rachel opened the folder, her practiced eyes moving rapidly across the pages. The afternoon light caught the slight tremor in her hands as her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine shock as she turned page after page. "These sentencing patterns," she muttered, shaking her head, color draining from her face. 10 years of data, Marcus added, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "Every case, every ruling, nothing left to chance." Rachel pulled out her reading glasses for a closer look, adjusting them carefully on her nose. The racial disparity in these sentences is staggering. And these financial transactions. She looked up sharply, her eyes wide behind the lenses. William Whitmore's campaign contributions? The timing can't be coincidental. "Precisely when his daughter needed a favor," Charles said, his voice cold and controlled, each word carrying the weight of suppressed anger. Rachel spread out several pages comparing dates and numbers with growing disbelief. "This goes beyond one case. Wallace has been systematically favoring wealthy white defendants while throwing the book at minorities." Her hand shook slightly as she pulled out her notebook. "How many cases are we talking about?" "Hundreds," Marcus replied, sliding another thick folder across the table. "We've documented every instance, cross-referenced and verified." Rachel's pen moved quickly across her notepad, the scratching sound almost urgent. "This will shake the entire judicial system. You understand that, don't you? Careers will end. Lives will change." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Charles said firmly, his jaw set with determination. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Ethan Wallace lounged in his leather chair, feeling satisfied with himself. Afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across his mahogany desk. Another day, another round of justice served. His clerk, a nervous young man named David, knocked and entered, his tie slightly askew. "Sir," David said, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot, I thought you should know. Rachel Lynn has been asking questions about your past rulings. She's been very thorough." Wallace laughed, the sound echoing off his wood-paneled walls, rich with condescension. "Let her dig. My record speaks for itself. 20 years on the bench can't be questioned." "She's specifically looking into racial disparities in sentencing," David pressed, his voice growing quieter. "And there are rumors about financial connections, specific patterns." Wallace waved his hand dismissively, his gold watch catching the light. "Standard procedure. Nothing to worry about." He turned back to his computer, effectively dismissing his clerk, who backed out of the room with visible relief. Back at the cafe, Rachel was already outlining her article on her laptop, her face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. "This will run tomorrow," she said, her fingers flying over the keys with practiced precision. "Front page. No one will be able to ignore this. The evidence is overwhelming." Charles nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the growing document. "Make sure every detail is ironclad. Wallace will try to discredit it. He has powerful friends." "Don't worry," Rachel said, her eyes gleaming with determination as she adjusted her glasses. "By the time I'm done, there won't be a single hole in this story. Wallace's own records will convict him." Later that afternoon, Rachel sat in her newsroom, surrounded by monitors displaying decades of Wallace's rulings. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as she worked, fueled by coffee and purpose. Her article was taking shape, each paragraph building an undeniable case of judicial misconduct. Charts and graphs filled her screen, painting a damning picture in cold, hard data. Her fingers moved steadily across the keyboard as she typed the final sentence of her exposé, knowing it would send shockwaves through the entire justice system. Charles Johnson leaned back in his leather chair, a rare smile playing at his lips as he watched the morning news unfold. Rachel Lynn's face filled the screen, her voice clear and determined as she detailed Judge Wallace's history of biased rulings. The morning sunlight streamed through the study windows, casting a warm glow on the mahogany desk where he'd spent countless hours building this case. "Breaking news this morning," the anchor announced, her expression grave. "Shocking allegations of systematic racial bias have emerged against prominent Judge Ethan Wallace. According to an extensive investigation that spans over a decade of court records." Charles turned up the volume, savoring each revelation like a fine wine. The news ticker scrolled steadily across the bottom of the screen. "Judge Wallace under fire for racial bias. Pattern of discriminatory sentencing exposed. Calls for investigation grow. Legal community in uproar." His phone buzzed continuously with messages from fellow judges and legal colleagues, but Charles ignored them all. Let them scramble. Let them worry about which side to take. This was just the beginning of the storm he'd carefully orchestrated. Marcus Reed burst through the study door, his face flushed with excitement, tie askew. "Chief Justice, you need to see this." He dropped a fresh stack of papers on the desk, his hands trembling slightly. "We found something bigger. Much bigger." Charles raised an eyebrow, maintaining his characteristic composure. "Tell me." "William Whitmore didn't just fund Wallace's campaign," Marcus explained, spreading out bank statements and transaction records with trembling fingers. "He's been paying him under the table for years. Through shell companies, offshore accounts, even cryptocurrency, they thought they were being clever. We've traced it all." Charles leaned forward, scanning the documents with practiced precision. "How much?" "Hundreds of thousands. But here's the kicker." Marcus pulled out a series of police reports, his eyes gleaming. "Savannah Whitmore has been caught shoplifting 6 times in the past 2 years. Designer clothes, jewelry, even a $1,000 handbag. Every single case mysteriously disappeared before reaching court. Not even a paper trail." "He's been buying justice for his daughter," Charles said quietly, his jaw tightening as he thought of his own child behind bars. "And Wallace has been selling it piece by piece." The news continued to play in the background as Charles absorbed this new information, each detail fitting perfectly into his plan. Public outrage was already building like a tidal wave. Social media was exploding with calls for Wallace's resignation. Legal watchdog groups were demanding a full investigation, and prominent civil rights attorneys were scheduling press conferences. Across town in his sprawling mansion, William Whitmore paced his marble-floored study, Italian leather shoes clicking against the stone. His phone rang, a private number. His hand trembled slightly as he answered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Yes?" The voice on the other end spoke quickly, urgently, with barely contained panic. William's face drained of color, his knuckles white around the phone as the messenger delivered the devastating news. "We have a problem," he muttered, gripping the device like a lifeline. His eyes darted to a framed photo of Savannah on his desk, his precious daughter, smiling innocently in her graduation gown, who he'd protected at all costs. But now those costs were about to become public, and there was nothing his considerable fortune could do to stop the avalanche of truth from burying them all. The afternoon sun beat down on the courthouse steps as hundreds of protesters gathered, their signs swaying like a colorful sea of outrage. "Free Maya!" they chanted, their voices echoing off the granite walls. "End racist sentencing." Charles Johnson stood among them, his usually stern face softening as he watched the growing crowd. People from every neighborhood in the city had shown up, united in their demand for justice. Rachel Lynn moved through the protesters with her camera crew, stopping to interview people from all walks of life. Judge Wallace's rulings show a clear pattern of discrimination, a young law student told her, clutching a sign covered in statistics from Wallace's cases. His hands shook with emotion as he pointed to the numbers that told a damning story. "My son got 5 years for the same crime that got another kid probation," a tearful mother shared into Rachel's microphone. "The only difference? The color of their skin." Her voice cracked as she spoke, but her eyes blazed with determination. Charles observed it all silently, his presence adding weight to the demonstration without him having to say a word. The news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Local channels broadcast live, spreading the message across the city. Social media buzzed with updates and live streams from the protest. Inside his chambers, Judge Wallace paced back and forth, his usually composed demeanor cracking. His phone buzzed again, another colleague declining to publicly support him. With a roar of frustration, he slammed the device onto his mahogany desk. The sound echoed through the empty room like a gunshot. 30 years on the bench," he muttered, running his hands through his gray hair. 30 years, and they dare question my integrity? His reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized, haunted and desperate. His phone rang again. William Whitmore's name flashed on the screen. Wallace answered it with trembling fingers, nearly dropping the phone in his haste. "Have you seen the news?" Whitmore's usually confident voice quavered. "They're digging into everything, Ethan. Everything. If we don't control this situation immediately, we both go down." The panic in his voice sent a chill down Wallace's spine. "Control it?" Wallace barked out a bitter laugh. "How do you suggest we do that?" The media's like sharks that have smelled blood. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. "There has to be something," Whitmore insisted, panic rising in his tone. "Call in favors. Threaten the reporter. Anything." "Don't you understand?" Wallace hissed. "Nobody's returning my calls. Everyone's running scared." His hand clenched around the phone until his knuckles turned white. Through his office window, Wallace could see the crowd growing larger. More signs appeared. Justice for all, not just the wealthy, and Wallace must go. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plaza, making the crowd seem even more imposing. The protest had taken on a life of its own. What started as outrage over Maya Johnson's case had evolved into something bigger, a movement demanding accountability from the entire justice system. Each new chant seemed to shake the very foundation of the courthouse. At 3 o'clock, Wallace sat heavily in his leather chair, watching the news coverage on his office TV. His face had lost its usual ruddy color, replaced by an ashen pallor. The reporters were relentless, dissecting his every ruling, questioning every decision. Each new revelation felt like another nail in his career's coffin. "This isn't over," he muttered, staring at his reflection in the blank TV screen. but the tremor in his voice betrayed his words. For the first time in his career, Judge Ethan Wallace felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, and he knew, with crushing certainty, that he was losing his grip on everything he'd built. The empire he'd carefully constructed over 3 decades was crumbling before his eyes. The fluorescent lights in Silver Creek's crowded cafeteria buzzed overhead as Maya Johnson sat alone, pushing a pile of mushy gray peas around her tray with her plastic fork. The food looked as unappealing as the drab, institutional walls surrounding her. At the other tables, the girls whispered and shot sideways glances, making it clear that Maya was the topic of their conversation. "Look at her acting all proper," someone muttered. "Bet she's never eaten cafeteria food before." Maya kept her eyes downcast, trying to ignore the stares. Her stomach rumbled, but she couldn't bring herself to take a bite. Everything felt wrong in this place. The scratchy uniform, the constant noise, the watchful guards always on patrol. Suddenly, a lunch tray slammed down next to her, making Maya jump. She looked up to see a tall girl with braided hair and hard, unforgiving eyes looming over her. "You don't belong here, Yale girl," the girl, Tanya, said with a smirk, dropping onto the bench beside Maya. Maya met Tanya's gaze steadily, refusing to show any fear. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice calm and resolute. Tanya threw back her head and laughed, drawing more curious stares from the other inmates. "None of us did, Princess. That's what everyone says in here." Before Maya could respond, a commotion across the cafeteria caught her attention. 2 larger girls had cornered a smaller, younger inmate against the wall. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 15, hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself appear smaller as one of the bullies grabbed her shirt. "Where's our food, Nicole?" the bigger girl demanded. "You owe us." I don't have anything," Nicole stammered, her voice trembling with fear. Without a moment's hesitation, Maya was on her feet. Her heart pounded, but her voice came out clear and firm. "Leave her alone." The cafeteria fell silent as all eyes turned to Maya. The bullies slowly turned, eyeing her with dangerous amusement. "Mind your business, new girl," one of them growled. "She is my business," Maya said, stepping closer. Her hands shook, but she clenched them into determined fists. "Back off." From his office window overlooking the cafeteria, Warden Philip Gates paused in his paperwork, watching the scene unfold with keen interest. Most new inmates kept their heads down, focused solely on survival. But this one was different. She had a fire in her that refused to be extinguished. The larger girls exchanged a look, clearly weighing whether Maya was worth the trouble. Behind them, Nicole stared at Maya with wide, grateful eyes. "Whatever," the lead bully finally muttered, shoving past Maya. "She's not worth it anyway." As the cafeteria slowly returned to its normal buzz of activity, Maya helped Nicole straighten her shirt. "You okay?" she asked gently. Nicole nodded quickly. "Thank you," she whispered, before scurrying away to safety. Later that evening, Maya sat on her thin mattress, her body aching from the tension of the day. But despite her exhaustion, she felt a small spark of pride. She hadn't let them break her. Tanya walked past Maya's bunk, pausing briefly. She gave Maya a slight nod, small but unmistakable. In this harsh and unforgiving place, respect had to be earned. Today, Maya had taken her first step towards earning that respect. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as protesters gathered in growing numbers. Their signs bobbed up and down like angry waves. "Free Maya! Stop racist sentencing! Wallace must go!" The crowd's energy crackled with purpose and determination, their voices growing stronger with each passing minute. Local news crews positioned themselves strategically, their cameras capturing the swelling tide of public outrage. Rachel Lynn stepped up to the microphone, her professional demeanor masking her own burning anger at the injustice she'd uncovered. The microphone whined with feedback before settling. Her hands gripped the podium tightly, steadying her resolve. "Judge Wallace's pattern of racial bias is undeniable," she announced, her voice carrying across the crowd. "How many other innocent young black men and women have been sentenced unfairly? The evidence shows this isn't just a few isolated cases, it's a systematic abuse of power." The crowd responded with loud chants of "No more Wallace." A mother held up a photo of her own son, tears streaming down her face. Others quickly joined her, raising more photos of loved ones affected by Wallace's biased rulings. Inside his chambers, Judge Wallace paced back and forth, his usual confidence crumbling as he watched the live coverage on his desktop monitor. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his tie for the third time that morning. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. His young clerk, Thomas, knocked softly before entering. The normally eager assistant now looked nervous, almost afraid to speak. His usual stack of papers was clutched tightly against his chest like a shield. "Sir," Thomas cleared his throat. "The governor's office called." Wallace's face drained of color. He gripped the edge of his desk, steadying himself. The polished wood beneath his fingers felt cold and unyielding. What did they want? They're concerned about the allegations. They're requesting a meeting. They specifically mentioned the protest coverage. Across town, Charles Johnson sat in a wood-paneled conference room with 3 state legislators. His voice was calm, but carried unmistakable authority as he laid out the evidence. The afternoon light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the mounting pile of damning documents. "This isn't just about my daughter anymore," Charles explained, spreading out documents across the table. "Wallace has been systematically destroying lives for years. Here are 20 cases where minorities received maximum sentences for first offenses, while white defendants walked free for worse crimes. The pattern is impossible to ignore." Senator Martinez leaned forward, examining the papers. "This is disturbing, Charles. Really disturbing. The disparity in these sentences is shocking." "If the courts won't act," Charles said firmly, "the people will. We need a formal review of every case Wallace has presided over. Every single one." Outside, the crowd had swelled to hundreds. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Rachel Lynn continued her speech, now joined by other community leaders and civil rights attorneys. The atmosphere hummed with a sense of long overdue change. By late afternoon, Wallace sat alone in his office, a glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. The ice cubes clinked against the crystal as he raised it to his lips. His jacket was thrown over a chair, his tie loosened. The proud judge who had ruled so confidently over others now looked small and afraid. The setting sun cast long shadows across his office, much like the shadows his decisions had cast over countless lives. He muttered to himself, "They won't take me down." But even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow and uncertain. The courthouse steps were crowded with protesters and news crews, as Charles and Camille Johnson made their way inside. Camera flashes lit up their faces while reporters shouted questions. Camille's hand trembled in Charles's steady grip as they walked through the heavy wooden doors. "They have to let her go," Camille whispered, her voice catching. Charles gave her hand a gentle squeeze but remained silent, his jaw set with determination. He knew Judge Wallace wouldn't surrender easily, even with the mounting evidence against him. Inside the packed courtroom, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. When Maya was led in wearing her detention center uniform, Camille had to stifle a sob. Their daughter looked thinner, but her head was held high. Her eyes found her parents, and she managed a small, brave smile. Rachel Lynn sat in the back row, her pen flying across her notepad as she documented every detail. Judge Wallace sat at the bench, his face an emotionless mask, but his eyes kept darting to Charles with barely concealed hatred. Marcus Reed approached the bench with a thick folder of documents. "Your Honor, we have extensive evidence of judicial misconduct and corruption." He laid out paper trails showing Wallace's financial ties to William Whitmore, along with a pattern of biased sentencing that couldn't be ignored. New witnesses came forward, one after another. A store employee testified about seeing Savannah Whitmore plant the necklace in Maya's bag. Security footage that had been corrupted was recovered, clearly showing the setup. Outside, the crowd's chants echoed through the courthouse walls. "Free Maya! Free Maya!" Wallace's composure cracked slightly as each piece of evidence mounted against him. His fingers drummed nervously on his desk while sweat began to bead on his forehead. The pressure was crushing, from the media, the public, and most of all from Charles Johnson's steady, unwavering stare. After the last witness testified, Wallace retreated to his chambers. He stood before the mirror, loosening his tie as sweat trickled down his temple. His reflection showed a man cornered, but his eyes still held a dangerous glint of defiance. This hearing was far from over, and Wallace wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered to life in Maya's cell as the metal door creaked open. A guard's stern face appeared in the doorway. "Get up," she ordered. "You've got a visitor." Maya's heart skipped a beat as she swung her legs off the thin mattress. Her hands shook slightly as she smoothed down her orange jumpsuit. Could this finally be the moment she'd been waiting for? The walk to the courthouse seemed to take forever. Each step echoed through the sterile hallways as Maya was led in handcuffs, her mind racing with possibilities. Inside the packed courtroom, Charles Johnson stood tall and commanding. His voice carried authority as he presented his final appeal. "The evidence of judicial misconduct is overwhelming," he stated firmly. "My daughter's conviction was based on prejudice, not justice." Judge Wallace sat behind his bench, his usual smug demeanor replaced by visible unease. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he shuffled papers, avoiding Charles's steady gaze. But before he could respond, the heavy courtroom doors swung open. Attorney General Mark Reynolds strode in, his expensive suit and confident bearing drawing all eyes. "Your Honor," he announced, his voice cutting through the tension. "A decision has already been made." Maya watched as Reynolds approached the bench, leaning in close to Wallace. Whatever he whispered made the judge's spine stiffen. The transformation was instant. Wallace's uncertainty vanished, replaced by his familiar cold arrogance. "The defendant will serve out her full sentence," Wallace declared, bringing down his gavel with finality. The courtroom erupted in shocked gasps. Maya's knees buckled, and only the guard's firm grip kept her standing. Through blurred vision, she saw her mother collapse into tears, while her father's face turned to stone, his eyes boring into Wallace with quiet, deadly rage. "This is an outrage," someone shouted from the gallery. Others joined in, their angry voices rising until Wallace threatened to clear the courtroom. Maya barely registered the journey back to Silver Creek. The handcuffs felt heavier now, the corridors darker. When they reached the transport area, reality crashed down hard. She was going back to her cell. Nothing had changed. The guard's keys jingled as she unlocked Maya's restraints. "Inside," she ordered, gesturing to the cell. Maya stepped through the doorway, her movements mechanical, her mind still struggling to process what had happened. The door clanged shut behind her with devastating finality. She stood in the center of her cell, completely numb. The thin mattress, the metal toilet, the narrow window with its bars. This was still her reality. The hope she'd carried all morning lay shattered at her feet. The evening shadows lengthened across Charles Johnson's study as he sat at his mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. The lamp cast a warm glow over his tired features, highlighting the deep lines of worry etched into his face. The door burst open with such force that it rattled the frames on the wall. Camille stormed in, her eyes red and swollen from hours of crying. Her hands trembled as she slammed them down on Charles's desk. How could they do this? How could they deny her freedom again? Her voice cracked with raw emotion. "Our baby girl is sitting in that cold cell while these men play their political games." Charles rubbed his temples, his controlled demeanor masking the fury burning beneath. The muscles in his jaw tightened as he looked up at his wife. "They're protecting Wallace. And now, we know who's pulling the strings." The sound of footsteps drew their attention to the doorway. Marcus Reed entered, his face grim as he clutched a thick manila folder. "Attorney General Mark Reynolds," he announced, dropping the folder onto Charles's desk. "He's been shielding Wallace for years." Charles opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. His eyes narrowed as he absorbed each damning detail. "Tell me everything." Marcus leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "Reynolds has systematically buried at least 6 judicial misconduct cases against Wallace in the past 3 years. But that's not all." He pulled out a particular document, placing it on top. There were police reports that could have cleared Maya, witness statements that contradicted the store's version of events. Reynolds made sure they never saw the light of day. Camille gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. They knew she was innocent? It gets worse, Marcus continued. I've tracked multiple meetings between Reynolds and William Whitmore. They're careful, but not careful enough. Private dinners, offshore accounts, campaign contributions through shell companies. Charles stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. His voice came out calm, but carried a lethal edge that made both Camille and Marcus fall silent. Then, we exposed them both. Across town in his dimly lit home office, Judge Ethan Wallace sat alone. An empty whiskey glass dangled from his fingers as he stared out the window at the night sky. His usual confidence had cracked, revealing the frightened man beneath. His phone buzzed, Reynolds' name flashing on the screen. Wallace answered with shaking hands. "Stay strong," Reynolds' voice commanded through the speaker. "We won't let them win." Wallace exhaled heavily, gripping his glass tighter. But even as he tried to draw strength from Reynolds' assurance, he couldn't shake the cold tendril of fear creeping up his spine. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prison yard at Silver Creek Juvenile Detention Center. Maya Johnson sat alone on a metal bench, her eyes fixed on the chain-link fence that separated her from freedom. The events of yesterday's court hearing played over and over in her mind like a cruel movie she couldn't stop. A cool breeze rustled through the yard, carrying the distant sounds of other inmates playing basketball. Maya barely noticed. Her hands lay limp in her lap, her shoulders slumped with the weight of betrayal. Heavy footsteps approached and Tanya Brooks dropped onto the bench beside her. The tough girl's usual swagger was tempered by something softer in her expression. "I heard what happened," Tanya said quietly. "They screwed you over." Maya managed a small nod, her throat too tight for words. What was there to say? The system she'd once believed in had failed her twice now. Tanya leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Listen up, Yale girl. This place, it can break you if you let it. Don't let it." Maya turned to look at her, really seeing Tanya for the first time. Behind the hard exterior, there was wisdom in those eyes, earned through pain. From his office window 3 stories up, Warden Philip Gates stood watching the exchange. His weathered face reflected in the glass as he observed Maya Johnson. In his 15 years running Silver Creek, he'd seen thousands of young inmates. Some arrived already hardened, others scared and lost. But Maya was different. He'd read her file multiple times. Perfect grades, Yale acceptance, a father who was Chief Justice. The evidence against her had seemed flimsy from the start, and now with all the protests and news coverage about Judge Wallace's bias, Gates was certain Maya Johnson didn't belong here. Back in the yard, Maya wrapped her arms around herself against the morning chill. I really thought they'd let me go this time," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, well, welcome to the real world," Tanya replied, but there was no malice in her tone. "The system ain't built for people like us." Maya felt tears threatening but blinked them back. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. "You're stronger than most of the girls in here," Tanya continued. "I've been watching you. The way you stood up for Nicole yesterday? That took guts." A ghost of a smile crossed Maya's face at the memory. Even in her darkest moment, she couldn't ignore someone being bullied. The morning bell rang, signaling the end of yard time. As other inmates shuffled toward the door, Maya stayed seated for a moment longer. Tanya stood but lingered nearby. "Coming?" she asked. Maya nodded, slowly rising to her feet. Her legs felt heavy, but she forced them to move. That night, lying on her thin mattress in the dormitory, Maya stared up at the cracked ceiling. The room was filled with the sounds of other girls sleeping. Soft breathing, occasional murmurs, the creak of metal bed frames. In the darkness, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible, "I won't let them break me." The words hung in the still air, a promise to herself, a lifeline to hold on to. Maya Johnson might be trapped within these walls, but her spirit remained unbroken. The morning sunlight streamed through the Johnson family's kitchen windows, but it brought no warmth to the heavy atmosphere inside. Charles sat rigidly at the breakfast table, his coffee growing cold as he scrolled through his phone, reviewing the latest messages from his investigative team. Across from him, Camille pushed scrambled eggs around her plate, the food untouched. The ticking of the kitchen clock seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. Camille's fork scraped against the porcelain, a harsh sound in the silence. Finally, she set it down with trembling hands. "What if we can't save her?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, hollow and filled with the pain only a mother could know. Charles slowly lifted his gaze from his phone. His eyes burned with an intensity that made even Camille draw back slightly. "Then I burned the whole system down." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Pulling out his phone, he dialed Rachel Lynn's number. The investigative journalist answered on the second ring. "Rachel," Charles said, his voice steady and determined, "I'm giving you everything, every document, every connection, every dirty deal Wallace and Reynolds have ever made. You're going to help me destroy them." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure about this, Charles? Once we publish, there's no going back. They took my daughter's freedom. Now I'm taking everything from them." Charles spent the next several hours in meetings with civil rights lawyers, building a case that would shake the justice system to its core. Marcus Reed arrived with 3 more boxes of evidence: financial records, court transcripts, and witness statements that painted a clear picture of corruption. "Look at this," Marcus said, spreading documents across Charles's desk. "Reynolds didn't just help Wallace. He's been orchestrating cover-ups for years. Racial bias, bought verdicts, evidence tampering. It's all here." Camille watched from the doorway as her husband worked tirelessly, his determination radiating from every movement. She knew that look in his eyes, the same look he had when arguing his most important cases before becoming Chief Justice. At 11 that night, Charles sat alone in his study, the room dark except for the glow of his laptop screen. His finger hovered over the send button. The email contained everything, every piece of evidence, every connection, every dirty secret that Wallace and Reynolds had tried to hide. He pressed send. The soft whoosh of the email leaving his outbox seemed to echo in the quiet room. Charles leaned back in his chair, knowing that by morning, Rachel Lynn would have everything she needed to expose the truth to the world. Rachel Lynn's fingers trembled slightly as she spread the documents across her desk in the quiet newsroom. The early morning darkness outside made the fluorescent lights seem harsh and unforgiving, much like the truth she was about to reveal. Each page told a story of corruption that went deeper than anyone had imagined. Her hand reached for her phone, dialing Charles Johnson's number. "This is enough to bring them both down," she said, her voice tight with anticipation. "The financial records, the buried police reports, the pattern of cases, it's all here." "Then do it," Charles replied, his voice carrying the weight of a father's determination. Rachel's article hit the internet at 7 a.m. sharp. By 7:30, major networks were picking up the story. The headline blazed across screens nationwide: Attorney General Mark Reynolds and Judge Ethan Wallace, a corrupt partnership exposed. Social media exploded. Justice for Maya and corrupt court started trending within hours. The article detailed years of buried evidence, suspicious financial transactions, and a systematic pattern of judicial bias that Reynolds had helped conceal. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of protesters swelled. Their chants echoed off the marble walls. "Free Maya, justice now." Signs waved in the morning air. "Black Lives Matter in court too," and "No more corrupt judges." Inside his chambers, Judge Wallace's hands shook as he watched the coverage on his desktop monitor. The door burst open, and Attorney General Reynolds stormed in, his face red with fury and fear. "They have everything on us," Reynolds hissed, loosening his tie as sweat beaded on his forehead. "The campaign contributions, the covered-up complaints, everything." Wallace stood up from his desk, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. "I can fix this," he insisted, but his voice wavered. For the first time in his career, he felt truly vulnerable. The protests continued throughout the day, growing larger with each passing hour. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their cameras capturing every angry face in the crowd. As night fell, The tension reached a breaking point. Outside Wallace's elegant suburban home, protesters gathered with flashlights and megaphones. Their angry voices carried through the darkness. "Resign! Resign!" The sound of shattering glass pierced the night as a rock crashed through Wallace's front window. He stood in his darkened living room, watching shards of glass scatter across his expensive carpet. The protective bubble of power he'd lived in for so long had finally burst. Judge Ethan Wallace's hands shook as he gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, staring down at the newspaper headlines that screamed his downfall. His usually pristine office, with its leather-bound law books and polished credentials, now felt like a prison cell. Crumpled newspapers littered the floor, each one bearing his face and words like corrupt, biased, and scandal. He yanked his silk tie loose, his collar damp with sweat. The morning sun streaming through his window felt like an interrogation light. His phone buzzed again, another reporter wanting comment. "This can't be happening," he muttered, snatching up his cell phone and punching in Reynolds' number. The Attorney General answered on the first ring. "We need to do damage control," Wallace said, his voice cracking. Reynolds' laugh was bitter. "There's no controlling this. I'm barely keeping the governor off our backs." The fear in Reynolds' voice made Wallace's stomach turn. In a burst of rage, Wallace hurled his phone across the room. It smashed against the wall, pieces scattering across his law degree. Outside his window, the crowd of protesters grew larger by the minute. Their chants echoed through the thick courthouse walls. "Justice for Maya! Wallace must go!" Signs bobbed up and down like angry waves. "Black Lives Matter more than white privilege," and how many others. Rachel Lynn's latest article hit like a sledgehammer. Wallace-Whitmore connection. Money trail reveals years of corruption. The detailed financial records Marcus Reed had uncovered left no room for denial. Wallace's secretary buzzed in. "Sir, the governor's office is on line 1. He ignored it, watching as another email notification popped up on his computer screen. Marcus Reed had leaked internal correspondence showing Wallace's pattern of dismissing appeals from minority defendants. The evidence was damning, irrefutable. His phone list, once filled with powerful allies, yielded nothing but voicemail messages and apologetic secretaries. "Senator Thompson is in a meeting. Judge Martinez cannot be reached. Commissioner Blake sends his regrets." The protesters' chants grew louder. Wallace peered through his blinds at the sea of angry faces below. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. His hands trembled as he reached for his resignation letter. The words blurred before his eyes as he typed, "I, Judge Ethan Wallace, hereby resign from my position." The walk to the courthouse steps felt like a death march. Each step echoed with the weight of his fallen career. Cameras flashed like lightning bolts as he approached the podium, the crowd's angry roar washing over him. The courthouse buzzed with nervous energy as Maya Johnson was led through the heavy wooden doors. Her orange jumpsuit stood out against the polished marble floors, but her head remained high. Reporters' cameras flashed, capturing every moment. Charles Johnson sat in the front row, his face a mask of calm determination. When Maya passed by, he reached out and squeezed her hand. "This is the day, sweetheart." Maya managed a small nod, but her heart pounded with fear and hope. Judge Lisa Carter entered the courtroom, her black robes flowing as she took her seat. Unlike Wallace's cold stare, her eyes were sharp but kind as she surveyed the packed room. "Let's begin," she said firmly. The new evidence was overwhelming. Security footage from different angles showed Savannah Whitmore clearly planting the necklace in Maya's bag. Financial records revealed the Whitmore family's payments to Wallace. Witness statements confirmed Savannah's history of false accusations. Prosecutor Robert Delaney could barely meet Maya's eyes as he stood. "Your Honor, in light of the new evidence, the state has no argument to maintain these charges." Rachel Lynn sat in the press section, her pen flying across her notepad. The story of corruption and redemption unfolded before her eyes. Judge Carter reviewed the documents carefully, taking her time. The courtroom held its breath. When she looked up, her voice rang clear and strong. The evidence before me shows not only Maya Johnson's innocence but a disturbing pattern of corruption that allowed this injustice to occur. The conviction of Maya Johnson is hereby overturned. All charges are dismissed." The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Maya's hands flew to her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. Charles wrapped his arms around her, his own eyes glistening. Outside on the courthouse steps, Maya stepped into the bright sunlight, finally free. Camille rushed forward, enveloping her daughter in a tight embrace. Mother and daughter clung to each other, both crying tears of joy and relief. The handcuffs were gone. The orange jumpsuit was gone. Maya Johnson was free, and justice had finally prevailed. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the floor, where Judge Ethan Wallace sat in his orange jumpsuit. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the defendant's table. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who once wielded the gavel now faced judgment himself. Charles Johnson watched from the gallery, his face unreadable. Next to him, Marcus Reed thumbed through a thick folder of evidence they'd gathered. The courtroom was packed, with reporters scribbling notes and former defendants Wallace had sentenced unfairly sitting with quiet satisfaction. The prosecutor stood, straightening his tie. Judge Wallace abused his power, perverted justice, and destroyed lives, he declared, his voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. He turned our justice system into his personal kingdom, where money and race determined guilt or innocence. Wallace's eyes darted around desperately, searching for a friendly face. William Whitmore was conspicuously absent. He'd cut a deal to testify against Wallace in exchange for leniency. Attorney General Reynolds had resigned in disgrace the week before. The powerful allies who once protected him had vanished like morning mist. Judge Lisa Carter studied the evidence carefully, her expression stern. "The evidence before this court is overwhelming," she began. "Mr. Wallace, you have betrayed the sacred trust placed in you as a judge. You have made a mockery of justice." Wallace seemed to shrink in his chair as Judge Carter continued listing his crimes. The systematic bias against minorities, the backroom deals with Whitmore, the countless lives derailed by his corrupt rulings. "Ethan Wallace, you are guilty of judicial corruption and obstruction of justice," Judge Carter's voice rang out. "You are sentenced to 15 years in federal prison." The gavel slammed with finality. Wallace's shoulders slumped as guards approached to escort him away. As they led him to his holding cell, he caught a glimpse of the same cold walls that had contained so many others he'd sentenced. In his cell, Wallace sat alone on the metal bench, staring at the blank walls. The same walls that had held Maya Johnson and countless others he'd wrongfully condemned. His kingdom of corruption had crumbled, leaving him with nothing but time to contemplate his crimes. Charles Johnson watched from outside as Wallace was led to the prisoner transport van. The man who had tried to destroy his daughter's life was finally facing justice. The system Wallace had corrupted was beginning to heal. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the courthouse holding cell, casting harsh shadows across Judge Ethan Wallace's slumped figure. His expensive suit had been replaced with a plain orange jumpsuit, his polished shoes swapped for cheap slip-ons. He sat on the metal bench, head bowed, fingers interlocked loosely in his lap. The heavy door creaked open. Wallace didn't bother looking up until he heard the familiar, measured footsteps. His eyes widened slightly as Charles Johnson stepped into view. "Why are you here?" Wallace's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. The once powerful judge looked small now, defeated. Charles stood perfectly still, his face unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Charles took a step forward, his shoes clicking against the concrete floor. "You destroyed lives because you thought people like my daughter didn't matter," Charles said, his voice calm but firm. "You saw them as statistics, not human beings, not someone's child, not someone's future." Wallace's shoulders hunched further, but he remained silent. "But I'm not here for revenge," Charles continued, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'm here to make sure this system never creates another Ethan Wallace. Your downfall isn't just about you. It's about changing a broken system." Wallace's hands trembled slightly. A tear rolled down his cheek, but he quickly wiped it away. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. What could he possibly say now? The guard appeared at the door. "Time's up. Transport's ready." Wallace stood shakily as the guard approached with handcuffs. Outside, the prison transport van waited, its engine humming in the gathering dusk. The metal doors stood open like a dark mouth, ready to swallow him whole. The guards led Wallace across the parking lot. Each step brought him closer to his new reality, 15 years behind the same bars he'd so carelessly sentenced others to. The van's doors slammed shut behind him with a final echoing clang. Justice had finally been served. Sunlight streamed through Maya's bedroom window, casting a warm glow across her familiar walls. The Yale brochures on her nightstand caught the morning light, their glossy pages a reminder of dreams temporarily put on hold. Maya blinked slowly, taking in every detail of her room: the soft purple comforter, the stack of law books on her desk, the family photos lining her walls. After more than a year of waking up to cold cement and metal bars, being in her own bed felt almost surreal. A gentle knock preceded Camille's appearance at the door. Tears welled in her eyes as she took in the sight of her daughter. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Maya managed a small smile. "Morning, Mom." Charles appeared behind Camille, his usually stern expression softening as he looked at Maya. "How do you feel?" Maya took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. "Like I have my life back." Camille couldn't help herself. She rushed to Maya's bed, wrapping her in yet another tight hug. Maya leaned into her mother's embrace, feeling the warmth she'd missed for so long. Later that morning, Marcus Reed stopped by, carrying a stack of newspapers. He spread them across the kitchen table. Headlines about Wallace's conviction dominated the front pages. "You're a symbol now, Maya," he explained, pointing to various articles about judicial reform. "People are talking about real change. Your case opened a lot of eyes." Maya traced her finger over one of the headlines, her expression thoughtful. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Rachel Lynn requesting an interview. Maya set the phone aside without responding. The thought of cameras, questions, and reliving everything still felt overwhelming. "You don't have to talk to anyone until you're ready," Charles assured her, noticing her hesitation. That evening, the Johnsons gathered around their dining room table. Camille had prepared all of Maya's favorite dishes, her famous mac and cheese, roasted chicken, and fresh green beans. The familiar scents filled the house, creating a cocoon of comfort and normalcy. As they passed dishes around the table, Maya caught glimpses of her parents watching her, Camille's eyes still misty, Charles's gaze protective and proud. The weight of the past year hung in the air, but with each bite, each small moment of normalcy, it seemed to lift ever so slightly. Maya cut into her chicken, savoring the taste of real home-cooked food. Through the window, she could see the sun setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, colors she'd only been able to imagine during her time behind bars. The simple freedom to watch a sunset from her own dining room felt like an incredible gift. Despite the comfort of being home, Maya felt a restless energy she couldn't quite shake. She knew there was more work to be done, more battles to fight. But for now, she focused on this moment, sitting with her family, eating a proper meal, being free. Maya sat in the Johnson family's backyard, her eyes fixed on the endless blue sky above. The gentle breeze and chirping birds felt foreign after months of concrete walls and metal bars. Her mind kept drifting back to Silver Creek, the cold cells, the echoing footsteps, the faces of girls who became more than just inmates. Camille approached quietly, placing a warm hand on Maya's shoulder. "You don't have to rush back into the world, baby." Her voice was soft, filled with motherly concern. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the sun on her face. "I know, but I can't just sit here either." The memories of Silver Creek wouldn't let her rest. The sound of her phone buzzing broke through her thoughts. Looking down, she saw Tanya's name on the screen. "Hey, Yale girl." Tanya's familiar voice brought an unexpected smile to Maya's face. It was the first real smile she'd managed in days. "Tanya," Maya breathed, relief flooding through her. "How are you?" "Getting by. Actually, I started something new." Tanya's voice held a hint of pride. "I'm working on my GED. Can you believe it? Me, hitting the books?" Maya's smile grew wider. "That's amazing, Tanya." "Yeah, well," Tanya paused. "You made me see I could be more than what everyone said I was. The way you carried yourself in there, how you helped others, it showed me there's always a choice." After the call ended, Maya found her father watching her from the patio door. She stood up, a new certainty in her steps. "Dad, I want to help people like Tanya. There are so many girls in there who just need someone to believe in them." Charles nodded slowly as if he'd been expecting this all along. His eyes held understanding and pride. Later that night, Maya sat cross-legged on her bed, pulling out an old Yale application from her desk drawer. The familiar blue and white logo stared back at her. She ran her fingers over the pages, remembering her old dreams of becoming a lawyer. Those dreams hadn't died in Silver Creek. They'd transformed into something deeper, more purposeful. She placed the application on her nightstand next to the photo of her family. The girl who'd first filled out that application was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who understood the true meaning of justice and compassion. Maya walked through the glass doors of the legal aid center, her heart pounding against her ribs. The office buzzed with activity, lawyers carrying stacks of files, phones ringing, and determined voices discussing cases. Marcus Reed stood beside her, his familiar presence keeping her grounded. "This way," Marcus said, leading her past cubicles filled with busy attorneys. Maya noticed the pictures on their walls, smiling families reunited, newspaper clippings of overturned convictions. This was where real change happened. In a conference room, 3 civil rights attorneys sat waiting. Their faces lit up when Maya entered. Marcus made the introductions. "Maya, these lawyers want to hear your story," Marcus explained. "They think it could help other wrongfully convicted youth." Maya's throat felt tight. She hadn't talked about her time in Silver Creek with anyone except family. But looking at the attorneys' earnest faces, she remembered Tanya and the other girls still trapped inside. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "If it helps others, I want to share what happened." Later that afternoon, Maya sat across from Rachel Lynn at a small coffee shop downtown. Steam rose from her untouched latte as Rachel set up her recorder. "Are you ready?" Rachel asked gently. "We can take breaks whenever you need." Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Yes." For the next 2 hours, Maya told her story. The frame-up at Whitmore Boutique, Wallace's biased sentencing, the long days in Silver Creek, and finally, her father's fight to expose the truth. Rachel listened intently, occasionally wiping away tears. "Your story matters, Maya," Rachel said when they finished. "It shows how broken the system is, but also how it can be fixed." The next morning, Maya's story ran in the national paper. The headline read, "Maya Johnson Speaks, How One Teen's Wrongful Conviction Exposed Systemic Corruption." Throughout the day, Maya watched from home as her story spread. News channels picked it up. Social media exploded with support. Justice for Maya started trending again, but this time with a new message. Reform the system. That evening, Maya sat with her parents in their living room watching the coverage. Her mother squeezed her hand as another news anchor discussed the impact of her interview. "A powerful voice for change," the anchor was saying. "Maya Johnson's story has become a rallying cry for juvenile justice reform." Maya stared at the TV screen, seeing her own face looking back. The scared girl from Silver Creek was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone ready to fight not just for herself, but for others. "We've already received calls from other families," Marcus told her over speakerphone. "They want your help exposing similar cases." Maya watched the headlines scroll across the screen, her name now associated not with scandal, but with hope and change. Ethan Wallace sat motionless on his thin metal cot, his once pristine judge's robes replaced by an orange jumpsuit that scratched against his skin. The cracked wall before him had become his daily view, each imperfection a reminder of his fall from power. His cell was barely bigger than his former office bathroom. "Look at the big-shot judge now," an inmate sneered as he passed by. Wallace's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The guards didn't even spare him a glance anymore. He was just another number in the system he once controlled. In the common area later that day, the TV droned in the background. Wallace kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the other inmates. Then he heard her voice. "We need to examine every case where bias played a role," Maya Johnson said firmly on the screen. Wallace's head snapped up. She sat poised and confident in a studio chair, her voice steady and clear. How many others are sitting in cells right now because judges like Ethan Wallace let their prejudices determine someone's fate? Wallace's throat went dry. The Maya on screen wasn't the scared teenager he'd sentenced. She radiated strength and purpose. Other inmates gathered around the TV, nodding in agreement with her words. "That's the girl you locked up, ain't it, Judge?" someone called out. Wallace couldn't respond. His hands trembled as he watched Maya describe her mission to help others wrongfully convicted. "I was given a second chance," Maya continued on screen, "but there are countless others still waiting for justice. We can't stop until the system changes." That night, alone in his cell, Wallace lay on his cot staring at the ceiling. The darkness pressed in around him, broken only by strips of moonlight through the barred window. His mind kept replaying Maya's words, mixing with memories of all the young faces he'd sentenced without a second thought. For the first time since his conviction, emotion cracked through his facade. "I was wrong," he whispered into the darkness, his voice hoarse. The words felt foreign on his tongue. He'd spent his entire career believing he was right, believing he was serving justice. Now he understood what real justice looked like. It looked like Maya Johnson, rising above her wrongful conviction to help others. It looked like everything he had failed to be. The lights went out across the prison block, signaling bedtime. Wallace remained awake, haunted by faces he'd never bothered to really see before, young men and women whose lives he'd altered with the casual bang of his gavel. Each face was clearer now, each story heavier on his conscience. But his realization came too late. His fate was sealed behind these walls, while Maya Johnson's voice rang out for justice on the outside. Maya stood before the mirror in the Yale Law School dressing room, adjusting her graduation cap for the 10th time. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed down her black gown. The gold honor cords draped around her neck felt both heavy and light, heavy with responsibility, light with possibility. Through the open door, she could hear the growing buzz of excitement in the auditorium. Her heart fluttered. After everything, the false accusation, the year in juvenile detention, the long fight to clear her name, this moment felt surreal. In the audience, Camille Johnson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while Charles sat tall and proud beside her, his usual stern expression softened by joy. Rachel Lynn, the journalist who had helped expose Judge Wallace's corruption, sat a few rows back, notebook ready. "Maya Johnson!" The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause as Maya stepped onto the stage. Her measured steps carried her to the podium with grace and purpose. Looking out at the sea of faces, she saw not just her family, but her journey. Every struggle, every triumph, every moment that led her here. She gripped the sides of the podium, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "7 years ago, I stood in a courtroom, falsely accused." Her voice rang clear and strong. "I lost a year of my life to a system designed to break people like me, but I refused to let it define me." Camille's tears flowed freely now. Charles reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "That year in juvenile detention opened my eyes," Maya continued. "I saw countless young lives being crushed by a broken system. I met girls like my friend Tanya, brilliant minds trapped by circumstance and prejudice. I promised myself then that I would fight for them." The audience hung on her every word. Even the usually stoic law professors leaned forward in their seats. "And now, I stand here, ready to fight for justice for others." Maya's voice filled with determination. "This diploma isn't just a piece of paper. It's a weapon against injustice, a tool to rebuild what's broken, a promise to every person wrongly accused. You are not alone." The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. Students, professors, and guests rose to their feet, applauding with genuine emotion. Rachel Lynn scribbled furiously in her notebook, capturing every detail of this historic moment. Later, at an upscale restaurant downtown, the Johnson family gathered around a beautifully set table. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching the sparkle of champagne glasses as they clinked together in celebration. To Maya, Charles raised his glass, his voice thick with pride. To Justice, Maya added, smiling as she touched her glass to her parents. Camille pulled her daughter close, whispering, "You did it, baby, you really did it." Maya looked at her parents, her father's quiet strength, her mother's endless love, and felt overwhelming gratitude. Their unwavering support had helped her transform a terrible injustice into powerful purpose. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the prison common room as Ethan Wallace sat hunched on a metal folding chair. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight since his sentencing. The TV mounted on the wall flickered with the morning news. And in other news, Maya Johnson graduates from Yale Law School today, the anchor announced cheerfully. Johnson's wrongful conviction 5 years ago sparked nationwide reforms in the juvenile justice system. Wallace's hands began to tremble as Maya's graduation photo filled the screen. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of determination and hope. The same eyes that had pleaded with him for mercy years ago, when he'd coldly sentenced her to juvenile detention. "Hey, ain't that your girl, Judge?" sneered an inmate named Rico, emphasizing the word judge with mocking disdain. "The one you tried to lock up forever?" Other inmates gathered around, grinning at Wallace's discomfort. He kept his eyes fixed on the TV, jaw clenched tight. "Look how far she went," another prisoner chimed in, "while you went nowhere but down." Wallace's shoulders tensed as quiet laughter rippled through the room. He remembered how it felt to sit high on his bench, looking down at defendants like these men. How powerful he'd felt in his black robes, how untouchable. Now he wore prison orange like everyone else. His gavel had been replaced by plastic utensils. His private chambers were now a cramped cell shared with a former drug dealer. "Ms. Johnson plans to focus her career on wrongful conviction cases," the news anchor continued. Her own experience of injustice shaped her dedication to reform. Wallace's mind drifted back to that day in his courtroom. He'd barely glanced at the evidence proving Maya's innocence. He'd ignored her tears, her parents' pleas, the obvious frame job. All he'd seen was another black teenager to make an example of. "You real quiet now, Judge," Rico taunted. "No fancy words? No maximum sentences to hand out?" Wallace stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Without a word, he walked stiffly back to his cell, the sound of jeering laughter following him down the corridor. In his bunk that night, Wallace stared at the ceiling as lights out was called. The concrete walls seemed to close in around him, a prison of his own making. Every creak and echo reminded him of the power he'd lost, the lives he'd carelessly destroyed. He thought of Maya again, not the successful law graduate on TV, but the terrified teenager in his courtroom. He'd tried to break her spirit, to crush her dreams. Instead, she'd risen above his cruelty to become something greater. Wallace turned to face the wall, his regret a physical ache in his chest. There would be no redemption for him, no chance to undo the damage he'd done. He was exactly where he deserved to be, forgotten, powerless, and alone. Maya Johnson smoothed her blazer and took a deep breath, savoring the moment as she stood in her new office. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on her desk, where a shiny nameplate proudly displayed Maya Johnson, Esquire. Her fingers traced the letters, still hardly believing this was real. The gentle knock at her door made her turn. Michael Grant, a respected civil rights attorney known for taking on impossible cases, stood in the doorway with a manila folder in his hand. His salt and pepper hair and kind eyes reminded her a bit of her father. "Ready for your first case?" he asked, extending the folder. Maya nodded, accepting it with steady hands. More than ready. But as she opened the file, her breath caught in her throat. The details jumped out at her like a punch to the gut. African-American male, 17 years old, accused of shoplifting at an upscale store. Security footage mysteriously incomplete. No prior record. Honor student. She closed her eyes, memories flooding back. The cold metal of handcuffs, the harsh fluorescent lights of the holding cell, the hopelessness. "Michael," she said quietly, "this case—" He nodded solemnly. "That's why I chose it for you. Sometimes the universe has a way of coming full circle." 2 hours later, Maya sat across from her client in a stark meeting room at the Juvenile Detention Center. James Turner looked so young in his orange jumpsuit, his shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. His mother sat beside him, gripping his hand. "I didn't do it," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But nobody believes me." Maya leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. "Neither did I." James looked up, confused. "7 years ago, I sat exactly where you're sitting now," Maya explained, her voice firm but gentle. "I was 17, accused of stealing something I never touched. They put me in juvenile detention for a year before the truth came out." Mrs. Turner gasped softly. James straightened in his chair, really looking at Maya for the first time. "What happened?" he asked. "A corrupt judge and a broken system tried to destroy my life," Maya said. "But instead of breaking me, it gave me purpose. I became a lawyer to make sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else." She opened the case file. "And I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen to you." Back in her office that evening, Maya spread the case documents across her desk. She studied the security footage timestamps, noting the convenient gaps. She reviewed witness statements, finding the same pattern of bias she'd experienced. Her phone buzzed. A text from her father. "Proud of you, sweetheart." Maya picked up James's intake photo, determination settling deep in her chest. The system had tried to break her, but instead, it had forged her into a weapon against injustice. She was no longer that helpless 17-year-old girl. She was Maya Johnson, Esquire, and she was ready for battle. Maya Johnson smoothed her blazer and took a deep breath, savoring the moment as she stood in front of the massive crowd. The autumn breeze carried their chants across the courthouse steps where she'd once stood in handcuffs. Now she stood tall, a beacon of hope for countless others. "Maya, Maya, Maya," the crowd's energy was electric. Signs bobbed up and down. "Reform now. Justice for all. End systemic bias." She gripped the podium, her voice clear and strong. "We have seen what happens when the system fails the innocent. But today, we take another step toward justice." The cheers grew louder, echoing off the courthouse walls. "5 years ago, I stood in chains where you're standing now," she continued. "A corrupt judge tried to destroy my life. But he didn't just hurt me. He hurt hundreds of others. Today, we say, never again." The crowd roared their approval. In the front row, she spotted familiar faces from her advocacy work. Mothers whose children had been wrongly convicted, teenagers who'd faced unfair sentences, activists who'd fought alongside her. Across town in a dingy halfway house common room, Ethan Wallace sat hunched in front of a small TV. His prison uniform had been replaced by threadbare civilian clothes, but his eyes held the same haunted look they'd developed behind bars. He watched Maya on screen, her presence commanding and powerful. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a notepad. He'd drafted dozens of letters to her over the years, all unsent, all inadequate. What could he possibly say to the young woman whose life he'd tried to destroy? The TV showed Maya hugging supporters, her smile bright and genuine. Wallace crumpled his latest attempt at a letter and tossed it in the trash. He didn't deserve forgiveness, and she didn't owe him anything. For the first time, the full weight of his actions crushed down on him. He'd abused his power, destroyed lives, all while hiding behind his gavel and his prejudice. Back at the rally, Maya wrapped up her speech to thunderous applause. She stepped away from the podium, shaking hands and accepting hugs from supporters. As the crowd began to disperse, she paused at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Maya looked up at the imposing building, remembering the fear and helplessness she'd once felt there. But those feelings were gone now, replaced by determination and purpose. She smiled, knowing it would never happen again, not on her watch. The system had tried to break her, but instead she became its reckoning. If you enjoyed the story of Charles, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.